Okay, so let me try a share now. Welcome everybody. Can everybody see the
Uh,
screen now with the lecture on it?
Yeah, half of
ye-
split.
yes.
Okay, all right. So I think that's more or less, we're going to give that a try.
Okay.
So great. So yes, and so we are working with uh, Pathwork Guide Lecture number 82, which is 82 of a series of 258 lectures channeled by a medium by the name of Eva Pierrakos that became known as the Guide Lectures, Pathwork Guide Lectures. This one was originally channeled on March 31st, 1961, and it's called The Conquest of Duality, Symbolized in the Life and Death of Jesus. So, and I'm just going to read and I'm going to pause. Feel free to break in, with questions, or, I will try to also pause every once in a while and see if anybody has comments, questions, that kind of thing. Okay, so greetings, my dearest friends. God bless each one of you. Blessed is this hour. Today's lecture is a continuation as well as an amplification of the last lecture, Conflicts in the World of Duality. This day, very appropriately, commemorates a very important event in your human history, which is closely linked to duality, the topic of my last lecture. On this day, Good Friday, Jesus Christ brought his life to a culmination in the greatest suffering and the greatest joy. This is meant not only in an abstract or remote spiritual sense, but also in a very human and concrete sense. Suffering and joy, pleasure and pain are dualities that, in the final analysis, are only subdivisions of the great duality, life and death. Never life or death, life and death. A spiritual teaching, often misunderstood, says that one must rise above pleasure and pain. This is, of course, true in the ultimate sense. However, it cannot come about by flight from the unpleasantness of the duality. Instead, the transcendence of pleasure and pain happens only by accepting and fully facing the duality, life and death. Those who misunderstand the meaning of rising above pleasure and pain do so because they wish to avoid rather than to go through these deep experiences. However, it is only when you accept death in its undisguised nakedness, without running from it, that you can truly live. Only then will you find that there is no death and no duality. You will accept this not as a consoling faith to which you cling out of weakness and fear, but as actual experience. And you can experience this only in the infinitely great and ultimate issues when you learn to experience it first in your daily little deaths. When your will is not done, and you cringe from suffering in the wrong, unhealthy way, you increase the tragic duality. You reject death, and therefore, in the ultimate sense, you reject life. The flight from death and suffering causes flight from life and pleasure, often inadvertently. No matter how much one may strive for joyful participation in life and pleasure, when one consciously or unconsciously avoids facing and meeting death and suffering, the escape will also be a flight from life and pleasure. The truth is that these two escapes always go hand in hand, and this naturally has a very damaging effect on the soul. So let me pause there. Any comments or questions? I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but this is sort of one of our hardest things, how to um, bridge these dualities. Welcome, Davis. um, so I think hopefully the guide will share a little more as we go, on how we can, you know, work with this concept of his that, is saying to embrace, the reality and to go into, through, and out the other side, and, to accept that, life and death, they come together. They're not you can't run from one. You have one, you have the other. And so how we can first learn in our everyday, daily little deaths, how to surrender, how to, be with our disappointment or whatever is there. And sometimes, I mean, we look at our world today and we see a lot of, lots of, huge deaths going on for people in ways, maybe not ultimate deaths, but, displacement and, lots of, uh, injury, war, it's like these are not small deaths. So, and there's a way that we can't control life. The very first lecture, the guide talks about this metaphor of life being a sea, about, great sea that we're actually crossing to get to the shore on the other side, and that we can't really control the tides or the storms, but we can learn how to navigate the boat, how to steer and guide ourselves so that we can arrive on, the soil of the spiritual shore that we're seeking. And so he says, when our will, our, self will, our little will, our personal will is not done, and, we resist that, we cringe from suffering in the wrong, unhealthy way. He says, you increase the tragic duality. And, oftentimes we see this, where, you know, I know myself, I do it, like when I have something, that I think is the right thing and I really want it done, I can, feel, like somehow maybe, a forcing current around trying to, get people to see my way or agree, or, like, and then of course if they reject it or whatever, there's all these kinds of things. And so, we're sort of learning how to, in this navigation process, how to, it's a vast sea and it's got lots of different cross currents and interesting, impacts on us. And so we're just, really almost, innocently, trying to navigate, trying to understand, trying to, go forward. But where we, cringe and run or try to avoid or defend against the difficulties of life, the little deaths, the discomforts, the pain, the, disappointments, that kind of thing, then, we increase the duality. And when we reject these little deaths, in some ways, we're rejecting life. And I don't know if people, I know I was like, as a kid, I remember, like everything that didn't happen the way I was hoping it would happen, I can remember saying to myself, after the experience, well, that's not it. And I think I literally erased the experience, like, that's not it. And I, kept going for trying to get this one experience or this way that the experience was supposed to be, right? And in the process, I think I sort of denied and lost a lot of, real experience that might have helped, me learn and guide me in a better way. But I just could not tolerate, the staying with what was. And so I had to erase it and start again, try again, So it's funny how our psyche is like that, like that. So continuing in the lecture, says the flight from death and suffering causes flight from life and pleasure, often inadvertently. No matter how much one may strive for joyful participation in life and pleasure, when one consciously or unconsciously avoids facing and meeting death and suffering, the escape will also be a flight from life and pleasure. So, yeah, he's saying that they always go hand in hand. And so, there's this way that you can understand this, like if we try to numb out or avoid the negative experience, that defense or that kind of, armor or scar tissue that we've, wrapped around us, to protect, actually, protects us also from the pleasures in life, the sensitivity that allows, the depth of pleasure in life. So I think, that is at least one way that they always are going hand in hand, because we can't numb out or, resist a sensation that's painful without also numbing out and not being able to receive the sensations of pleasure.
Excuse me, Darlene. I just want to say, I thank you for going back to the point of going over where it was said that if you think of your will not going your way, the things that don't go your way on a daily basis, to think of those as little deaths. Because I kind of glossed over that point the first time, but that kind of sinks in there. I thought immediately, oh, I can lock that in, that point throughout the year if I write maybe a 4-line snippet in the form of a eulogy and almost an artistic, humorous uh, focus or perspective on little things that don't go my way throughout the month, so I can lock in that message that was just
Ah, interesting.
reiterated. But what I also just thought of was, I'm glad you really brought that up and went over it again, because I just thought, well, there's the things that bother me right now or every day are just things that are not going my way, but I kind of reframe it as, this person is not doing the right thing, meaning it's still not going doing what I want to be done, which I think is right. But I'm in angst every day, and the funny thing is, as you're glossed over, you went over that point again about your will not going your way. I just thought, well, I do death meditations all the time. This Buddhist death meditation, the 9-point death meditation.
Uh-huh.
And I always say maybe I should up that more when I get stressed out or relaxed, to remember the overall point. I can always relax in the end. But honestly, this little point right here, I think, is very nuanced and subtle, where it can more attach to what I go through every day, to look at these deaths as the little wheels not going every, because I still kind of do my death meditation, but still get angst by the everyday things that are not going my way. I'm thinking this little snippet that you kind of zeroed in on would be a good one. So just wanted to say I just kind of connected with that point.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so, yeah, there is a way that we can, apply this and, notice very much, and that awareness, we can work with this as a kind of death process. And, it's very rich. There's different ways. I loved what you mentioned about a eulogy, or just even, kind of like, what I find is that, grief is multi-layered. And so we get, impacted by something that wasn't what we wanted. There's a grief process that we have to go through. And so the first part of the grief is, anger or denial, or, like where we're, resistant. And if we can go, like quickly, ideally, or drop below that level, because what's underneath that is, the ultimate sadness, the hurting, the brokenheartedness, the loss of something that we hoped for or we wanted. And when we can, drop through all of the "he did it to me," or the blame or the shame, all of these layers, right? That are just aspects, I think, ultimately, of trying to come to terms with it. And I think the quickest way to do that is to hold ourselves in the loss, which is also a practice for death, right? An acceptance of grief and the work with that feeling. So great. Thank you for your sharing. So then Jesus saying, become ye as little children, has meaning on many levels. One, is that children live and experience very acutely. All their senses and faculties are new and fresh, and every life experience on any level of their being is much more acute than the impressions, reactions, and experiences of the adult. You can imagine this, right? We all sort of vaguely remember how sensitive we were as children, and if we don't, it's also, good to sort of realize that, you know, even now we hurt, but back then we were wide open, right? And so there wasn't any kind of buffer for us. And we were very dependent, so the slightest, you know, rejection or disapproval or whatever was, keenly, keenly taken in. And so, he says that this is good for the soul who goes through life rejecting the experience of life with all its meaning, deadens its faculties for living. So, this kind of, at least this beginning, like we come in with this great sensitivity. But I think it also kind of tends to be part of what cause us to, run for the defenses or try to numb out or, defend a little more. And in our culture, sensitivity is not honored. It's not embraced. It's like get tough. Be resilient. All of these things, and so oftentimes, the sensitive part of our inner child being, is not really deeply acknowledged and well appreciated. But this is what he's saying. It's like it's the very source of the depth of pleasure and joy in our lives. And so we want to see if we can find a way to, hold ourselves in the pain so that we can also expand and enjoy the beauty and the pleasure. It is much better for the development and growth of an entity to go through many heights and depths than to falsely construct a serenity that is rarely a true detachment. Detachment is achieved only after one has accepted all that life has to offer, including death. Some people believe that they have risen to genuine acceptance, when in reality they simply reject pain and suffering, and therefore also pleasure and joy. Such persons will find at some juncture in their evolution, be it in this life or later, that they have to come back to the point at which they fled from their soul experience, so that the experiences they have avoided can be learned by fully going through it. And so again, we tend to want to know things, in our mind and intellectually, and like life though is this like, cellular experience, this direct impact, this, and a lot of it we can't even make sense of, we just do go through, um, and it's informing us in all kinds of ways, in the depths of our unconscious, in ways that we can't even understand, and all of that is part of our life experience. And I think, most, I, near-death experiencers, talk about the life review and stuff like that. So I think, that's where we have an opportunity, maybe, or at least my hope is, to kind of explore and take our time and understand much more of everything that was happening, because it just seems like, we are, like there's such an immensity, and to be, fully conscious and understanding it all, I think is a development that, we're gradually inch by inch, increasing, but it's a lot. And so, we're kind of riding the waves, surfing as best we can, surfing the moment, getting through things, and hopefully in that process, we're definitely making our progress towards this spiritual shore. But he says such such people who reject pain and suffering will find at some juncture in their evolution, that they, will have to come back where they fled from experience. And so this is also, I think, what happens in our life, like as children, we have to flee from that experience. It's too overwhelming, and we have to create defenses, and we have to find a way to, survive in, that experience. And so then, you know, uh, as adults, when we have more wherewithal and more, capacity within us, then those experiences can be integrated in a better way. And so a lot of the, inner work is really, and what happens is we actually are recreating that. We will, find some various unconscious ways of sort of projecting onto our experience, or actually magnetizing to us an experience that will have enough similarity to, the childhood wounding, or, difficult times in our experience, that, we will sort of get re-triggered, and yet we're more conscious now. And so by being re-triggered, we can learn more, especially if we don't get totally immersed in it. So, again, I think it's nature's way, it's life's way of helping us integrate and move through all of this material, um, and where we could not metabolize it all, then we store it, and sometimes we store it for the rest of our lives. But ideally, within the context of our lives, we bring that back up, and find our way to work through it, and integrate it, and heal it, and expand ourselves, open ourselves, be more available to life and pleasure and joy. Only those who have gone through the feared experience can arrive at true serenity. The soul whose serenity is not real, or is artificially cultivated, is much less developed than those who are courageous enough not to flee from the life experience. But it often happens that the former believes to be above the latter, whom he or she despises for their ups and downs. So you may know, people like that, that think that, they're kind of exceptional in their, ability to ride life's, but there's a certain way that it's a rigidity and a mask, right? The guide is talking here about what he often refers to as how we, sort of manage life and manage our own experience through our idealized image, how we think we should be, and through sort of our own defenses that are our masks and pretenses, right? It often happens that, let me skip that. I think I read that. So these ups and downs indeed indicate that those people are still deeply involved in the illusion of opposites and duality. But nevertheless, they meet the illusion and grapple with it, which is honest and growth producing. So partly he's talking here about spiritual bypassing, right? That many people on the spiritual journey, confused. I don't think they're doing it, intentionally, but many paths are sort of more like focused on the transcendence. And I think in it's one of the things I like about the pathwork is it's really a transformational path. It's not a rising above path. It's a going down into and through and out the other side path. And that seems to me, like he says, to be more honest and growth producing in the long run. So, courage and honesty are perhaps the most important assets in one's development. If you face your suffering and your joy, you will grow. The person who cringes away from suffering, denying, never facing it, and irrationally fearing it beyond its true proportions, is inevitably equally afraid of happiness and fulfillment. So again, it's kind of like I think one metaphor I've heard before, is like sort of the deeper we dig out the well, the more joy it can hold, right? So there's this kind of deep excavation, and, maybe the digging is an excavation is painful, but then it expands our capacity to hold the waters of life. And so I think It's another way of kind of talking about what he's saying. A few times in the past, I mentioned fear of happiness and fulfillment. Many of my friends have found this to be true. That we actually, like are kind of identified negatively with our suffering because in some ways we're afraid to risk or afraid to claim or afraid, to deserve happiness. It seems somehow far away and unattainable, but there's an internal part of that, right? It may seem that it's that way out in the world, but the guide is often saying that what we're observing in the world comes from our inner experiences and conclusions, and so if we fear, that risk, for true life, then happiness probably does feel far away and seeming unattainable because you can't really have the full range of happiness of life if you are unwilling to risk, if you play it safe, if you kind of hold back, and we have to also do gradual. So I'm not saying, just go jump off a cliff. I'm saying, we have to kind of hold ourselves at the edge of the cliff and keep challenging ourselves to consider, if it's possible to risk something. And this is a cliff that we know we need to jump, not something just crazy or some some belief that this would save us or make us wonderful. But when we have a deep intuition of where we're working and we can see how we are holding ourselves back, and we are contracted against something that we really long for, which is another duality. We're both longing for it and afraid of it, and so this often is part of what creates our painful state of unrequited longing, and emptiness inside, because there's this deep longing that we have for it that's very real, but there's also this place where something is within us that is still afraid and unable to say yes to that longing wholeheartedly and without reservation. So any other comments or questions here? So when happiness, it goes on, is far away and seemingly unattainable, we can safely long for it, right? However, if you observe yourself closely, you will see that when you get near it, you cringe from it, just as you cringe from suffering. And since suffering and pain, or death and life, are connected and are in reality one and the same, your happiness and pleasure are also connected to your attitude toward death and suffering. As you accept the one, so you also accept the other. As you rise and grow through one, so do you rise and grow through the other. And again, it's like, we can work to accept it, through, contemplation and meditation. And I did my, Dying into Life, 5th-year TP part of the program where we kind of explored facing our death. But I think it is the best way that we work with, learning to embrace the death within life, is to learn how to work with and go into our own grief, disappointment, loss, fear, pain, suffering, that happens on our journey, and it's not something that, I mean, again, it's like the storms of life that we don't control oftentimes. Now, the guide does say that we often bring certain storms to us, and that's true as well, as part of, how we also practice and learn, so we do recreate, but at a certain level, there are certain twists of fate, certain kinds of experiences, I think, that, kind of come to us out of the blue often, and these are also very strong, fateful moments that can have carry death in the midst of life as well. Maybe a death of a loved one, of a beloved pet, of, something, that we wish would never happen, but of course will, right? So as you accept the one, so you will also accept the other. And as you rise and grow through the one, so you do rise and grow through the other. Your attitude towards suffering determines whether or not your soul benefits during the experience or only much later. Even a blind and rebellious attitude towards suffering will eventually benefit the soul, and it is better than a flight from suffering by paralyzing and deadening the capacity to feel and experience. So he says, it's better to just fight and resist, and be mad, or, go to that part of the grief part, rather than to numb out, to be in denial. So, an honest fit and tantrum sometimes, we have to recognize it for what it is, and ultimately not just justify it, but, like the release of that energy, the going through the truth of, the inner no to what just happened, that you don't want to, an experience that you really wish you didn't have to go through. And, that no, the guide says in some other lectures, is like a sacred no. Because without that no, even when it's misapplied, we would not have free will, right? And this is the one thing that is, our greatest spiritual gift, is the gift of free will. And so, we have our right to our rejection of death and our resistance to death and stuff like that. But he says it's better to do it actively than, and emotionally, than to just numb out and try to transcend or rise above it in a false way. Your attitude towards suffering determines whether or not your soul benefits during the experience. Like, I think I read that right. So yeah, let me go back up a little bit and just reread. Even a blind and rebellious attitude towards suffering will eventually benefit the soul. And it is better than a flight from suffering by paralyzing and deadening the capacity to feel and experience. And, I don't know that we do this consciously, right? So, but we have to kind of become aware, where we might feel some numbness, or where we might unconsciously have an intention to not feel, to avoid feeling. However, a blind and ignorant attitude towards suffering will make you suffer more and longer than necessary. So if we are rebellious, it's better than avoiding it completely, but it will add to the length of the process. And the process of growth can commence only when your consciousness has learned not to avoid it. Conversely, a healthy attitude that retains awareness will obtain immediate growth and liberation. That which formerly made you suffer, ceases to be an element of pain the instant you recognize the lesson it can teach you, the value in it, right? And the purpose. Like, sometimes I feel like, I can handle suffering as long as it's not senseless suffering, meaningless suffering, But if I can understand that there is a ultimate, movement, there's a purpose, there's a way that it can deepen me, then we can affirm it. And then just in that, without the resistance, the suffering can move through more quickly. There's an old saying that says, what we resist persists. So if we're, resisting that suffering, then, we're holding it in place and increasing, dragging it out. By no means does this imply that you should deliberately choose suffering and reject happiness in the false belief that pleasure and joy are contrary to the will of God. Many religions teach this error. The healthy way to meet suffering is perhaps the most important key in life. If you meet it openly and wholeheartedly, willing to learn from it, keeping your reason and faculties intact, Although emotionally you may be plunged in darkness, rebellion, cowardice and self-pity, but we still are kind of more or less somewhat present and aware, that we're, being plunged into this state, like we can ride it through. It's the wave. And the outcome will be happiness to the degree that we have grown from the suffering you have already gone through. If suffering deadens your soul, more suffering, although perhaps in a different form, must follow, until you no longer allow your soul to be deadened by it. Then your entire personality will be revived by increased self-awareness. A particular confusion confronts a growth-pursuing spirit in its approach to suffering. Many self-aware people understand that suffering is self-created. Your realization of this, whether vaguely or fully, causes you to become frantic whenever suffering comes your way, if for no other reason than the frustration of not knowing instantly by what particular attitude or action you have created it. So I remember this stage, and it's like, we deeply want to avoid suffering. and then when we know somehow, it's something within us, we accept this principle, we don't just blame the outside, then it gets really sort of this intense, wanting to be able to escape the suffering by knowing how we're creating it. And in some sense, because the intention and the motivation is still the escape rather than the openness, the, acceptance, it creates the same kind of backwash in the reaction. So not having the knowledge makes you fearful that more suffering may come from this hidden cause. And since you are impatient, either consciously or unconsciously, to find out, you sabotage all your attempts to get to the cause. What is done in impatience, haste, frustration, or fear inevitably slows down the process of activity. So, this is like also really important for us to kind of recognize. And again, when we see that we're being impatient, like we have to be careful, because the next thing we're going to do is, be angry at ourselves for being impatient, or be impatient with ourselves for being impatient, so we have to like recognize and allow what is, embrace and be in the flow of what is moment to moment, but, acknowledging it. And when we notice impatience, the more quickly we can just acknowledge that part inside, and honor it. Okay, impatience is here. I welcome you. Hello, impatience, like then somehow the impatience goes, oh, good. I can relax. I don't have to be impatient anymore. There's something, deeply healing in, just simply naming, acknowledging, allowing whatever is here to be here. And so, including our suffering and our impatience with our suffering, all of it. Those who believe that God caused their suffering, which they have to accept without understanding the reason, often fare better, right? This is the old way that we used to understand, like religions used to teach, it's like God's a mysterious and nobody knows why things happen, but, you just have to bear it. It's your fate, it's your destiny. Maybe it's, some punishment, that you bear, but, it's an action of God. You can't argue with it. You can't change it. And so sometimes that might have helped somewhat with this aspect of surrender. But he says they may not discover their self-created underlying causes. And this is a pity, since this too has to be done. But their attitude is much more relaxed and open. However, the belief that God causes suffering is shaped by a lazy fatalism and leads to the logical conclusion that God is cruel and sadistic. And so unconsciously, even we often feel that if we have this sort of tendency or slightly unconscious belief. And, you all may never think this consciously or know that it's not true in your conscious mind, but if you're like me, there's parts of our unconscious that do hold to these understandings or feelings, and can sometimes, be in the state of, hurting because it feels like God is being cruel and sadistic and punishing one, in a very sad way, in isolation or in some kind of loss of potential dream or longing for, a certain, pleasure in life that we seem to be deprived of. So the best way of dealing with suffering combines the active spirit of searching for one's own inner hidden causes with the relaxed attitude of accepting for the moment the unwanted pain and fully understanding that the self-produced misery is of therapeutic value. Like it's helping us. It's in support of our development and growth, even though it might be difficult. It has a purpose. It serves us. So here again, a right combination of healthy activity and passivity is needed, as opposed to the mixture of distorted activity and passivity, which is often, where we go. And so, again, the guide has many lectures on sort of this, healthy, active and receptive current in life, and how all creativity comes out of this, healthy balance between the active and the receptive currents, and where we get lost in some ways is like when we're using an active current where we should be receptive, and we're, in a receptive state or a passive state where we should be active. So, he's just bringing that into the mix here. He says, you cannot truly solve the seeming mystery of suffering in life if you do not solve your own problems brought on by a faulty attitude toward life and death, pleasure and pain. How can you meet life's conditions unless you meet yourself face to face in your innermost hidden conflicts, attitudes, and beliefs, and comprehend the real meaning of your reactions? Right? We notice and sometimes justify our reactions. This is an invitation to become curious, and discover, learn more about ourselves. Who are we, and who are the parts of us? It's not even usually, our true self, but some, defense or some, traumatized part of us that is in reaction. So anytime you are disturbed, find out what it is that you want and what it is that you fear. So those are always really great. Anytime you notice some disharmony, some disturbance in your system, look inside with those two questions. Is there something that you want, and is there something that you fear? Go beneath surface reasoning. Don't try to figure it out and think about it. Go beneath the surface desire and fears, which are in reality a symptom of a particular way of running from death and suffering, and therefore from life and happiness. So, it's like, there's several layers, and so we can work with all of those layers, but like both, basically, if we go all the way, we discover we're back in this kind of dualistic battle, from, between life and death, happiness and unhappiness. To begin by tackling the big general issues will never get you anywhere. True growth happens only when you tackle your seemingly insignificant daily reactions of desire and fear. Only then will you learn the right attitude toward life and death. See how you run from death in the little things and recoil from suffering in the minute details of life that could in themselves even seem unimportant. First, question yourself about the most mundane, insignificant issues which cause you even the slightest disharmony, right? And those are the ones that, like, I think, we can work with most easily in the beginning, and, begin to, develop a kind of self in presence that can work with much more difficult feelings, right? When you pursue this self questioning to the point of asking, why do I want this? And why do I fear not getting it? You will come to the love you desire and to your fear of not getting that love. When you flee from love, fearful that you may not get it anyway, or that you may lose it again, you are courting death because you fear it. In a similar way, you reject love, fearful of being hurt, fearful of not getting it or losing it again. You try to convince yourself that you do not want love. The same happens when you inwardly try to convince yourself that you do not want life, because you know that one day life in the body will cease. All little issues ultimately lead to the question of being loved versus not being loved. And that is basically, therefore, to a life versus death, right? That's another form of life versus death. When we're loved, that's life. When we're not loved, that's a kind of death. When from your fear of not getting what you really want, you deliberately choose what you don't want, you create an unhealthy deadening condition within your soul. It is unhealthy because you do not honestly acknowledge to yourself that you really want love and life, and that you really fear not getting love and life eternal. This condition is unhealthy because you deny yourself what you actually could have, although it may not be to the degree you wish it. You may not get the kind of love you desire, exclusive, limitless, guaranteed with absolute certainty that you will never lose it again. But because any limitations of your wish would create unbearable frustration of your exaggerated belief that the non-fulfillment of your wish is unbearable, you forfeit the love you could have by rejecting it altogether. So that's a big sentence. I don't know if you could follow that. Let me try it one more time. He says, because any limitation of our desire, of our wish, might create this unbearable frustration of, sort of this exaggerated belief that non-fulfillment of the wish is unbearable, right? So this is one piece of this that I think is less noticed. But sometimes, when we, are in a state of deprivation, and it's a painful state, no doubt. But anything that we say we can't stand in life, right? That's kind of saying, I don't have the adult legs under me to, bear the weight of this. I can't, I can't face it. I can't feel it. So I'm running from it. I'm dissociating. I'm, unable to bear this. And, most of the time it's just a feeling. Most of the time what we're running from, what we can't bear, what we can't stand, is a state, is a feeling, is something that, is an exaggeration, to believe that it is truly unbearable. And then when we kind of realize, we're kind of dramatizing, how unbearable this might be, that can also help us relax and open and accept, at least temporarily, the limitation, the disappointment, that kind of thing. So, back up a little bit again and say, so, when we fear not getting what we really want, and we deliberately choose what we don't want, we create an unhealthy deadening condition within the soul. It is unhealthy because you do not honestly acknowledge to yourself that you really want love and life, and that you really fear not getting love and life eternal. So, it's better here, like even if, you long for this, and it's so tempting just to, get numb about that, or, to reject, unconsciously or consciously that longing, to turn it into a kind of sour grapes attitude, or, a negativity, negative pleasure in some ways, right? Rather than just staying with this longing that's unfulfilled, and painful. And, if we can, just stay with it as it is, and not exaggerate it, into, some kind of fear of never having it, or never having it forever, which, ultimately, it's like we do have it. We always have it. We will always have it forever. But in the human condition, we don't realize this. And so this condition is unhealthy because you deny yourself what you could actually have, although it may not be to the degree that you wish it. So sometimes we have to receive and accept, like limited fulfillment, or not exactly, kind of like the way I was saying, that's not it. Well, if I could have said, oh, well, that was close, or that's getting there, or something like that, I could have embraced my experience and not rejected it. Right, and each experience is valuable and valid in and of itself, even if it's not exactly what we wanted. So you may not get the kind of love you desire, exclusive, limitless, guaranteed with absolute certainty, that you will never lose it again. But because any limitation of your wish could or would create unbearable frustration, based on this exaggerated belief that your non-fulfillment of your wish is truly unbearable, then we forfeit the love that we could have, the available love, the love that's here now, even if it's not the ultimate love that we want. We forfeit the love that's here by rejecting it altogether. And so you make it worse. In the same way, your desire never to die makes you reject life. All of your everyday reactions and problems can be traced back to these basic issues. Therefore, these basic issues will have personal meaning and application for you. This is the important step you need to take in your development. Most important in this respect is that so often you are unaware that what you fear are death and suffering. Rejection of love signifies both. You run away not only from death and suffering, but also from your fear of both. And this is what you have to uncover first. Only then can you adopt a healthy attitude toward death. Outwardly, you may not be aware of this fear, but deep down, it may still be there, if only to a small extent. Face in yourself that place where you still fear. Become aware of it, and then you can learn to die, and thus to live. As you become aware of your real fear of death in any form, physical death itself or a negative occurrence, you free the life force in you, which will then invigorate you to meet that which you fear. And then often when we actually meet that which we fear, and I've experienced this several times, there's like this, very strong sort of spiritual grace and presence within that. And, you realize it wasn't at all what you thought, or it wasn't at all it's not gonna be like what the greatest dread that, you're holding with it. And it actually, unravels itself, finds its way through. And in some ways, by going into, through, and out the other side of that fear, now you've dismantled it, in that programmed place in our vehicle. So, we can release that fear, and that, belief in that fear. The fear of the fear is basically what it is that we first release. And then when we don't have the fear of the fear, then we can usually meet the fear and move through it in a way that will expand us and help us heal. So the life of Jesus Christ symbolizes this age-old truth in a very wonderful way. It has been known by all the sages and great truth seekers of all times. It is represented in many philosophies, religions, and myths. Through Jesus Christ, it has been symbolized in his actual life and death, for Jesus met his death in the very spirit I have stated here. Many of Jesus' sayings and utterances were not recorded and passed on to posterity, especially those not understood by people, because in humanity's limited understanding they seem to contradict his other teachings. It is not mere coincidence, however, that his last utterance was recorded and passed on to humanity, in spite of its seeming so crassly contradictory to what people believed of and wanted to see in Jesus Christ. Jesus' last words on the cross expressed his doubt and fear that he was forsaken by God. This has puzzled many people. How could that great spirit doubt and fear? Human illusion and idealization would have preferred that Jesus died in a glory of faith, without the human doubts and fears he expressed in his hour of the culmination of his facet of Jesus' life, of his suffering, culmination of his suffering. It was very important that this utterance be transmitted to humanity, since every single facet of Jesus' life and death has deep symbolic meaning for humanity's personal problems. So this utterance too must have significance. It can be fully understood only if you grasp the meaning of this lecture and the previous one. In this last hour, Jesus forgot all he had known, all the revelations and insights he had gained. Has it not happened to each one of you to some degree in hours of desperation and anxiety, that even though your intellectual memory remained what you have learned and known, you are not in command of this knowledge? Your soul was in a dark night of unbelief and doubt. Deceiving yourself about this state of mind and not acknowledging how you really felt is not the right solution. To feel guilty and proud as you think I should not feel and think that way leads only to self-deception that delays your coming out of your darkness. It's interesting how he phrases that there, because, our idealized self-image, kind of makes us feel guilty and proud. I should not feel and think this way is a type of statement from the idealized self, right? That, is what leads to self-alienation, self-deception. And that is what delays our coming out of darkness. So Jesus illustrated this most clearly. He, the greatest of all great created spirits, was in doubt too. He too had lost faith for a moment, but he acknowledged it and did not hide it from himself or from others. What does that mean? It means the stark naked fear of the unknown, of death, and the acute suffering of physical, mental, and spiritual pain. Jesus met it squarely, without pretense, without self-deception, without deceiving those who had faith in him. He was truthful to himself, and therefore to all who believed in him. He was truthful even in his last moment. Many a spiritual teacher or authority would hesitate to admit moments of fear and doubt, would feel ashamed and afraid of losing faith with the disciples. This basic fear is often rationalized by acceptable explanations. The teacher may excuse this untruthfulness by the seemingly commendable attitude that does not want to let down or weaken the disciples. But in fact, it is the lack of truthfulness that lets others down. Jesus' truthfulness had not let anyone down, even though they could not understand how it was possible that the Master experienced doubt in his hour of death. Most did not know that in this very doubt and fear was an important directive and lesson for all. But even though they did not consciously understand, inwardly they felt more strengthened than ever, because truth goes directly to the heart and soul, even if at times it bypasses the brain. When intellectual explanations do not obscure what the heart and soul perceive, and the personality allows the intuition to function in spite of seemingly contradictory intellectual considerations, the person has a deep purity and innocence that has nothing to do with the words purity and innocence as used by bigoted religionists. The person who has this innocence and purity adopts the childlike attitude Jesus recommended. Jesus' advice to become as little children praises children's willingness to experience life intensely. Jesus' disciples have this quality. They too experience fully. And Jesus Christ himself showed this amply in his life as well as in his death. He went through his suffering to the full extent, without restriction, without shame, in admitting his doubt and fear, pain and vulnerability. Only those who have this great childlike openness can experience true joy. This he demonstrated not only during his life, but also by his reappearance in spirit. But of that, very little is recorded. Again, as it occurs so often, this factor is misunderstood or not fully understood. Even those who understand that Jesus' resurrection and appearance indicate the continuation of spirit life, they do not go far enough in understanding this phenomenon from a worldly point of view. They think simply that Jesus showed only that life goes on, and that is all there is to it. This phenomenon was not meant to prove just that life does continue in the spirit. It will mean something more to you right here and now, while you are still in this incarnation. If Jesus Christ, in his hour of despair, forgot what he had known, it is even more certain that other people will do the same when going through hardships. Intellectual conviction can only do so much in such times. Jesus knew this better than anyone. Jesus' reappearance could not be more than theory for those who were not present, and for the succeeding generations it did not bear a deeper meaning. His reappearance clearly states, quotes, "After having met my ordeal fully, without pretense and self-deception, having gone through it to the ultimate end, I now live in the true full sense of the word." You too can do it. You do not have to wait for physical death, because you die many deaths every day in all your little ordeals and struggles. The manner in which you meet these determines the subsequent life and fullness of joy that can be yours. If you meet these ordeals and struggles in a similar spirit of truthfulness, you will experience life and joy while still in the body to the same degree. This is the message, the ultimate meaning of his reappearance apart from all other meanings. Here is the greatest lived symbolism ever demonstrated. So let me pause just for a second. Any commentary or questions? How did that land? I mean, it's a beautiful but deeper understanding, I think, of what Jesus helped us to understand and see. And if we can bear witness to this in ourselves and to, face things in this way, and often, we get shamed, our culture teaches that we should be like this you know, apparent God that Jesus was, you know, and somehow face it all like that. But it's like, this is the humility, you know, this is the true acceptance of our humbleness, our humanness, our earthiness, our hummus, you know, and the depth of our feeling. And so we can embrace both, and that is what creates the resurrection.
Um, I'm liking the, you know how in a lot of religions, like you have to have almost like this blind faith no matter what, and to keep that faith and not have it in question or in doubt. Rather, when Jesus is telling his disciples that, and he's being very open and vulnerable and saying, I, especially in that final hour, is I have doubts myself,
Yes.
and there's doubt in faith, and that kind of gives that relaxing feeling of, okay, even in this life, I don't have faith in a certain outcome of it happening. It's okay for me to have that doubt
Yes.
and not hide it.
Exactly. Beautiful. And you know, that's how it touches me too. Like, you know, there's a kind of, oh, thank goodness. You know, I don't have to somehow, you know, be more than what I am. I can be as I am. And that's all that's required,
Yeah.
to give the fullness of ourself just as we are. And if, you know, like he says, you know, like if even Jesus, you know, was, you know, weakened and lost in, you know, a state of suffering, you know, how could we, you know, we cannot expect ourselves to like have that kind of perfection, you know, in our development yet, where we can completely embrace, you know, death without fear and, you know, suffering. So, you know, I think that it's a beautiful thing that I agree with, you know, just like, oh, I can relax a little more. I can just be who I am. Very beautiful way of looking at that message.
I was thinking too that besides being an antidote to that kind of perfectionism, um, where we have our child still feeling at some level that it has to protect because something overwhelmed us or would crush us otherwise. It's showing that the child believes that if it's bad now, it's always going to be bad and nothing's going to change. And somehow fully accepting even you know, everything that Jesus accepted, even losing faith, that too is temporary and will be gone through if we can meet it. And we're not doing it alone. Life itself is accompanying us if we can let it in. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Well said. And so important, right? You know. And and it's good to remind ourselves to know that right now in our understanding in our hearts, and also to realize that, you know, there will be times, you know, as much as that's comforting us now, that it won't be available to comfort us, you know. And yet, like you said, you know, whatever we're facing is not forever. The guide says, you know, like the lower self and the suffering is always the temporary, and the ultimate, you know, forever reality is the love and the, you know, beauty and the divinity of all of life. So, thank you.
And it's almost like if we can't open to the suffering, we can't let the life carry us either.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like
Tricky.
it's kind of like contracting and we're fighting, the flow of the river, that if we could relax, it could carry us. Right. Good. So, yeah. Okay. I think we got a little time left and a little bit more of the lecture left. So, but thank you, everybody. Great comments. And yeah. So life on Earth is a symbol of reality and not vice versa. And so it is with Jesus' life and death. It meant much more than a lesson to each individual about the history of evolution, life after death, and the promise after death. To find out what it really means, you do not have to wait until the time when you leave your earthly body. You have daily opportunities. Whether you can now believe in a life after death does not even matter. Every day offers an opportunity for everyone, wherever he or she may or may not, whatever he or she may or may not believe, to make the best of life by realizing that the everyday little death is meeting it. By realizing what the everyday little death is meeting it is. Scott, excuse me. Now I've got the sentence. Okay, let me try it one more time. So the best of life by realizing that every day little death is meeting it, and in doing so, learning to discriminate between that which is inevitable and that which is not. If you meet that which is inevitable, which is physical death, as well as the results of your past wrong attitudes, in a spirit of relaxed receptivity, passivity, while at the same time wanting to grow and learn from the experience. So we're meeting it with curiosity, with, you know, wanting to understand. You will recognize where and in what way you choose difficulties that are not inevitable. And so for the more you choose the latter, the more you invite and court extremes that should be avoided. So, in some ways, this sort of reminds me of the, serenity prayer, right? Because, there's a way that there are things in life that, you know, we just simply can't change, and so our best thing is to surrender and accept and be with. And then there are things, that we can learn about and realize how, we might be able to change and save ourselves, spare ourselves, improve things. And so, that discernment that's always very subtle, to determine what it is that is what cannot be changed, and to learn to accept that, and to discern that which, can be changed, and learn, to have an active response to that. So there's this, again, discernment between the balance and when to use the active and when to use the receptive channels within us. Only by a very personal self-search can you determine how you react to both that which is inevitable and that which is not. This question poses a problem similar to that of independence and interdependence. Only personal self-analysis can provide the answer to each individual. There is no other way, no general rule to which one can rigidly adhere. I recapitulate. Since isolation and loneliness come from an inner unrecognized dependency as opposed to the healthy interdependence which results from reliance on the inner self, so it is with the question of inevitability. By running away from that which is inevitable, you bring upon yourself avoidable handicaps. You are so afraid of the inevitable hardship that you take onto yourself more and more hardship by trying to avoid that hardship, right? Find this pattern and you are bound to discover that inevitable hardship ceases after you have acknowledged and gone through it. Now, are there questions? Okay, so some Q&As are like kind of right on topic, and some of them, wander a little bit. But let's see where these go. It says, "How can?"
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah. Speak up.
Oh, one of the ways that I used to make things difficult for myself was if I was disappointed, or the things that happened that were painful, that somehow that meant I'm bad, I'm wrong. And so trying to avoid that and believing in the false self, you know, and instead it's just like there's something wrong with your thinking that's not aligned with truth. So the whole point is to stop suffering, is to change how you think about yourself, life, others, whatever. So that kept me running in circles for quite a while.
Yeah. No, it's very, like again, there's a combination, so the part of us that then, says something's wrong with me, that's a part that again is both a thought form and an image, right? It's we have the idealized self-image and we realize we don't measure up, so something is wrong with us. But it's also an internal state and feeling, right? And so, to change the thinking in a way, you, is not to just recognize that that thinking is false. What I found is kind of the best is to actually go in to acknowledge, not merge with, but acknowledge this part that feels this way, right? And like actually again accepting, embracing it as it is, and from that place where it's in relationship to sort of my inner higher self and my inner wisdom, and it feels connected. It feels like it's not being denied or rejected, or we're not thinking, saying you have to be different than you are. um, then from that place, we can re-instruct. We can bring in this awareness that our adult consciousness has, of the misunderstanding in the thinking. And when it is being held in that relationship, it can receive that, re-education and correction. If we try to do that from, just our mental, understanding, it often, cannot receive it so well. So there's
Right.
this,
It's a superimposition
yeah,
rather than
a
an
re-education.
opening. An
Right.
opening. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So question, how can a hardship not be a hardship? Take torture, for instance. Good question here. I'm not afraid of death, but of the agony of dying. Answer. As long as one has not gone through it, it is a hardship. You are not expected to tell yourself the opposite. Quite the contrary. To deny your fear would be one form of running away from or negating death, and therefore life. Only when they who have gone through death have the certainty that there is not death. Only. To find this out, they must go through it. The lesser degrees of death, such as all forms of suffering, must also be experienced in order to discover that they are not the extremes of death or suffering that were feared. So what he's saying is, in our imagination or our fear, it's maybe, way more than what it actually is, and that doesn't belittle what it is in any way, but even people, in some of the near death experiences on YouTube, when they actually talk about the process of their dying, it often, like one would think, would be some difficulty, but somehow, you know, they are removed from the body. I think there's even a TV show called The Reaper, where it's kind of like a comedy thing or a dark comedy thing where, like when a soul dies and its assignment is to become a reaper, which, it stays on earth in physical form, but it has assignments to go be where death is, happening to somebody, and they take the soul, they reap the soul before the death befalls. Now, I don't know, that's just a metaphor, but I think something like that. And in my life, when I've been, had to go through, the deaths that, I would have wanted to avoid. That's been my general understanding in every time. It's been really scary, really felt impossible to face it. Every part of me was in resistance. But when the whole process actually occurred, there was some grace around it, and it was not nearly what I thought it was going to be. So, it's not to belittle it, but, often our fears are way beyond, what in fact, reality of it is. So, and again, he says to find this out, we must go through it. So, and he's saying, when we do go through it and experience the extremes of death or suffering that are feared, often they are not painful or annihilating at all. You will find many instances of this if you look back on your life. When you review certain of your life experiences, you will find that you were apprehensive about, and what seemed disproportionately horrible as you stood before it, ceased to be dreadful once you were through it. Ultimately, you were untouched by it, except in the positive sense, because the experience caused you to grow. It added to your whole personality, not only to your thinking process, but also to your emotional life. If you very truthfully question yourself, in looking back, you can admit that the experience is no longer a horror. The horror, therefore, must have been unreal, for reality is permanent and unchangeable. Only an illusion loses intensity as time goes by. Yet as long as you experience something that is unreal as a reality, the remedy is not in talking yourself out of it. Trying to avoid the inevitable is useless. What really helps is to acknowledge your fear and suffering. And in this acknowledgement, that's how we relax into it. You cannot avoid the illusion of suffering by telling yourself it is illusion. It is real for you, and therefore you have to go through it. Remain conscious of your intellectual knowledge all the while, without forcing it on your emotional reaction. Allow both to exist freely side by side. As you observe your thoughts and feelings, this may make it easier for you to go through the suffering and really experience it. For only a wholehearted entering into the life experience with all its components will help you to rise above the dualities. Question. You said one could let people down only by untruthfulness and not by any other way. Could you explain that a little more, please? Answer. When I use the word truth, I do not mean the little truths people often express in a thoughtless, cruel way, which have nothing to do with truth. At times, the great truth may not contradict the little truth at all. The little truth, however, may at other times be very much opposed to the great truth. There is no rule or regulation that you can lean on here. As with all truth, each case stands for itself. Discrimination and an active thought process are necessary all the way through in order to realize when a little truth corresponds with the great truth or when it does not. So we have our little emotional truths, the reality of what is, and then we have the larger context of, and context within it. One's own motivation furnish the real answer to this question. If one is honest with oneself, one can detect that little hurtful truths come from a personal fault or weakness, be it pride, vanity, self-will, rebellion, insecurity, frustration, or whatever. Even if these inner motives are covered up by more valid reasons, that does not eliminate the existence of the underlying current, which determines the result. But when you are truthful with yourself, You cannot, in the ultimate sense, let anyone else down. Gaining this truthfulness with self is, after all, the goal of your self-search on this path. So I don't know if that made sense to people, but I think what he was talking about was, like a lot of times we think of telling each other the truth means confronting each other with, our observations of their faults and failings or something like that, and there is a kind of honesty that we think of in that, but he's saying that's not really, the truth that we need, that we need to be, truthful to ourselves, and if we are that way, then we can't really let anyone else down. And that's a deep thing that, you can really sit with and maybe work with in different ways, but an interesting statement for sure. And I do believe that there's something resonates very true in the intuition when he, talked of the importance of, Jesus not letting us down by acknowledging the humanness that was, that he also was, so the understanding is that, he was both human and divine, and that he didn't betray either side of that. So question, I would like to ask you about the emphasis the church places on the bodily resurrection of Jesus. What is your comment on that? Answer, there are two aspects involved, one of which I have commented on in the past. About the first aspect, I repeat briefly that it is a misconception that stems from the inherent fear of physical death. People want to believe in a physical continuation of life. Therefore, they need to interpret Jesus Christ's reappearance as a physical resurrection. The other aspect has a much deeper and wider significance. It contains the deepest wisdom and truth, but in symbolic form. This symbolism I explained extensively in the previous lecture. Jesus Christ's resurrection teaches symbolically that if you do not flee from your fear of death, suffering, and the unknown, but go through it, you will truly have life in its deepest sense, while you are still in the body. Pure, unadulterated life can be had only if death is met squarely. In using the word pure, I do not suggest that what is generally understood by purity, an insipid state that rejects the body. The body is part of the spirit, and the spirit part of the body. Both form one whole. That is why Jesus Christ appeared as a human body, to show that the body is not to be rejected or denied. If you accept death, you will be resurrected in life, in the body, by the flowing life force which will truly make you experience pleasure and joy on all levels of your being, including the physical level. Is that clear? So he's saying, in our acceptance of death, we have more fullness of life as we are incarnate. So question, yes, but your statement as to the error of this thinking would lead one to conclude that the parts of the gospel which describe the disciples' arrival at the tomb as a story of promise are entirely false and not a factual account. Answer, no, not at all. When Jesus appeared to his disciples, his dear ones, a phenomenon occurred that has always been known and will continue to be known if certain circumstances prevail. In your time and age, it is called, I believe, a materialization of spirit substance. It is condensation of spirit matter, as all physical life is. But the fact that this happened contains a deep philosophical and psychological meaning which is generally ignored. The meaning, as I have explained, that if you meet both life and death, you cannot die. You will then live in the true sense of the word. Therefore, what the disciples saw was real, although most of them did not understand the meaning and purpose of the event, even though Jesus tried to explain it to them, as he had often done before. There were a few who understood, but not all of them. Those who did not took it simply as a phenomenon, which in itself was not unique. Question. Now, those of us who do not consciously believe in existence after death and do not consciously desire existence past death very much, like to enjoy and take pleasure in this present physical life, meaning the body and the pleasures and sensations of the body. I would like to ask a question concerning such a person. Given talent and a certain personality, including the need to sublimate, is the desire to produce art and by that creation become immortal the same thing as a belief in life after death? I'm not asking about whether there is life after death. Answer: I know you aren't. I am not going to attempt to answer that, for whatever I or anyone else might say would not make any difference. You can arrive at it only through your own experience. If you superimpose a belief that is not genuinely yours, it is much more unhealthy than admitting an unbelief. That is just one of the points I stressed in the last lecture. Now I will answer the other aspects of your question. In the first place, let me make it quite clear that real knowledge and experience of the continuation of life after physical death, if it is generally arrived at through development and the right and healthy attitude as described in these lectures, cannot, and will not sacrifice the bodily pleasures for the sake of a spiritual life to come after the physical one. It is quite the contrary. Only those who cling to religious faith out of fear and weakness will come to the conclusion that one opposes the other. In fact, if these two lectures are really understood, this will become quite apparent. Since the freed up life force must flow through the body, it makes the whole person more receptive and capable of pleasure on all levels, including the physical one. However, this complete pleasure can be experienced only if the soul is healthy. An unhealthy soul is incapable of experiencing pleasure. At the same time, if a person heals unhealthy aspects and attitudes of the personality, that person not only becomes capable of experiencing greater pleasure, but also leads a fuller life. Almost as a byproduct, there is also an increase of creativity. People like that begin to experience the reality of spiritual law and truth. It is no coincidence that people who go through a successful analysis often come to believe in the reality of spiritual laws and truth. This rarely indicates acceptance of denominational religion, but rather the presence of their own private realization, experience, inner proof, intuition, knowledge, that these are all byproducts of healing the soul of its misconceptions, distortions, and deviations. The true experience of pleasure on all levels, the unfoldment of creative abilities, and the inner knowledge of spiritual truth all result from inner health. At the same time, the sicker or more distorted a soul, the less it is capable of real pleasure, and the more will its inherent creative abilities be paralyzed. The fact that some people are very creative in spite of tremendous inner conflict does not contradict this statement. In these cases, the creative talent is so great that it is expressed in spite of the soul problems, and shows how much such a person is cut off from reality on all levels. This means not only that cosmic laws and spiritual truth are disregarded, but that reality as it manifests on this earth plane is also ignored. The desire for immortality through art is just another variation of human entities' longing for life eternal and its struggle against death. One person will be a religious fanatic who has accepted a belief out of fear and weakness and not through inner knowledge. Another believes to be stronger than the former because he or she does not need such faith. But this form of expression through the work produced emerges from the same root, the desire for immortality. Neither wants to let go. They want to hold on to life. They cannot give up. This holding on, this inability to give up, whether manifest in the big question or in everyday little issues, holds the soul imprisoned. It prevents the growth. produces some form of stagnation on all levels of the personality. Only the generous freedom which comes from giving oneself up and going into the unknown without any assurance of retaining what one cherishes, only that can produce true growth. So the wish for immortality through art or science or any other expression is in essence not that different from the way of the religionist who clings to faith out of fear. As I explained in the last lecture, the atheist too goes off the path and meets death in the wrong way, just as the ungenuine religious person does. The latter says, I want to believe because I'm afraid of death. I do not want to let go, to give up. And the atheist says, the person who believes is just weak. I am so much stronger, I do not need all that. But this person too wants immortality and thinks it is a show of strength to seek immortality through creation. It is another way of clinging to life and fighting against death. This type of person is so afraid of ceasing to exist that he will not risk believing and then being disappointed if the religionists are wrong. Both types are incapable of admitting that they do not know and that they have to accept the unknown. Now, my friends, the many people who outwardly admit this ignorance do not necessarily mean it, feel it, and live it. They too may manifest the flight from death in their innermost attitudes. This is not what one professes and thinks, one believes, that determines a healthy attitude. That is only an indication. So you must be aware of beware of evaluation based on a person's professed belief and attitude. The desire to die, for instance, does not necessarily indicate a true belief in life after death or one's reconciliation with non-existence. It may merely be an expression of being tired of coping with life, which of course is the result of not knowing how to cope with death. Now we come to the matter of sublimation. Sublimation can and very often is entirely misunderstood and is a very unhealthy phenomenon. It can be a distorted and harmful process in the religionist as well as the psychoanalyst concept. So he goes on here. I think I'm going to skip a little through this. He's saying, that sublimation again is like kind of resistance, and that if we try to sublimate the desires, the life of the flesh is sinful, it opposes spirit, it represents the devil, and I must sublimate my fleshly impulses and spiritualize them. This leads to repression. And when you view repression with a fresh outlook, you will see that it is nothing more than dishonesty, self-deception, and an ostrich attitude and a lack of self-awareness. On the other hand, the psychologists assert that reality is so dismal, so hopeless, so despairing, and stands in such contradiction to any pleasure drives that I have no choice other than to sublimate. So I choose it out of compromise as a lesser evil. On the one hand, I would have to live according to the most unchanneled and primitive instincts if I want to realize my pleasure drive. But on the other hand, that would bring me into conflict with my environment, and therefore I would be stopped from pleasure a priori, so the situation is hopeless. These unchanneled primitive instincts are not more conducive to the pleasure principle than is the spiritualized rejection of bodily pleasure. In a mature and healthy soul, the pleasure drive can never interfere with one's environment. This is not due to sublimation, resignation, or repression. It happens because the instincts grow within the rest of the personality and therefore become, as development proceeds, all the more receptive to pleasure in a much higher form than the primitive unchanneled instincts. This heightened pleasure includes the physical level. Such inclusion comes, in turn, from facing death and suffering. It happens through eliminating negation and slowly, bit by bit, melting away the duality, and also the defenses and the, numbness that we have. And in doing so, reality as we know it on earth begins to change, first subtly in our inner world and slowly in the outer world. So, in closing, he's saying, it's entirely wrong to say that the creative ability is the product of sublimation, or to put it in a different way, that it comes from shifting the pleasure drive to another area of the personality. The healthy human personality, as it is meant to be, is rich enough to contain both the pleasure of creativity and the pleasure of sensuality, right? As well as many other modes of expression in life. Only the limited and distorted soul has to make such choices. It is quite true that if you repress your pleasure drive, it must still express itself somewhere else, and quite often does so in the area of your creativity. But that does not mean it could not be expressed more clearly and powerfully if your personality were whole and integrated and functioning healthily on all levels. It would manifest in a more constructive and full way, not as a substitute for, but as a completion of life. My dearest friends, on this very special day, I've tried to show you how the present phase of our work, of your inner development, fits in with the greatest events of history, of evolution, cosmic and human. Be blessed, all of you. Receive our strength, love, and blessings. May you take the strength and utilize it as is best for each of you. Be in peace and be in God. Okay, I'll stop the share. That was a bit of a longer lecture, so we made it through. But I thought there were many beautiful points and many great comments. Any last, sharing or commentary that anybody wants to?
Yes, everything was beautiful. Everything presented. So thank you, Darlene. My last comment share is towards the end. That point mentioned of how that image of a religious person clinging to their prayers out of fear, on the same scale with the artistic person, clinging to expression, kind of out of like escaping from just confronting life. So I thought about when 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 it was kind of being expressed in that section where um, I think what I got from it was when it was mentioned, when it was giving the image of the artist kind of clinging to the art. I thought of the way I kind of internalize or maybe speak to myself when I think of like working on something for my growth artistically, be it drawing or writing. I'd still have this nagging sort of way of looking at it as something that's presented to others in the end, even if it's personal. And I know that's out of like habitual, just conditioned learning in the West, where you have, audience and people who the artists, and so it's just kind of something ingrained out of just living in the West. But what I thought was, and I've always wanted to transition out of that habitual sort of base thinking. But I thought was when I juxtapose and match that last point of the piece to an earlier point mentioned, where we went into where you went into and confronting life for the purpose of just being with it and spending time with the condition you're in at that moment, as opposed to finding the answer out of it, saying it's bad or whatever. I thought about connecting that piece with this last piece of how the artist kind of can cling too much to art, or the religious person cling to a prayer, of how that reinforces the idea of just letting go of the time factor of trying to keep up to pace with accomplishing, resolving some issue in your life. The time piece that's connected with trying to resolve some tight, horrible situation you're currently in, you're trying to get out of it. Letting the time piece and the idea of keeping up the time to and your accomplishment of getting out of it, letting that drop, and I started to realize how the whole purpose of the art is to just for myself, what helps me have a different internal state. As the same moment when I kind of realized, when the section was going into earlier, how one should just confront and sit with the condition and sort of escape it, that I should also be a watcher in life. When a condition happens to me, spend time with it. And then, as in the artistic piece, spend time on just describing the condition. Don't worry about trying, because I think a little bit of my artwork, it's a little bit of a, how can I use artwork subconsciously to see a direction out of a tight situation, not just to relieve me. But now I realize even trying to get out of a situation is unnerving or anxiety ridden because it's a time factor. It's like, think of the next art piece to help you really get you there. As opposed to with that piece early in the section where it said just sit with the condition. I thought, well, my artwork, I could even transition into just doing pieces over and over and over just to get them extract out, even if it's a bad situation I'm in, to extract out what that situation really feels like in many different colorations, gradations, and thinking of art, approaching the art that, at that moment to relieve myself. I think that's also relaxing because I'm not running away from time crunch to escape it. And also, the other point was when it was mentioning to confront your life situation earlier. I also thought, yeah, the point was not for me to think of internal structures to help me just justify a situation, but how to help me even say, let me purposely see how this is a value, and to spend time in the situation with different lenses, almost in a just to have many options of saying something. So just wanted to throw that eureka moment out there that I couldn't kind of voice too articulately just now, but those two pieces really kind of struck a good chord with me. So that's my last final share. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kenny. Yeah, I'm glad, and I mean that question in the Q&A at the end was like I think kind of specific to, using art as sublimation. And there's only one reason for art, but it's interesting how you brought that together because I think yeah, you could be, using your art to, kind of find the answer or get out or, escape the situation, or you could use maybe the art to internally meet it more fully, right? And explore it, through the art, and then you may want also to share it, with others, but it may not come from, like the need to be validated in your art, but just a way of sharing something about, who you are to people that care about you, right? So, yeah, many levels with all of that, but beautiful. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Like, I don't know if you've ever experienced any of these Pathwork lectures before, but I find that there's a lot of good stuff in them usually. So glad to have you aboard. Hope you can join us again in a couple of weeks. Um, Anybody else want to chime in here? Looks like a few of you are still trying to stay awake.
I had a quick question about, it sounds like the guide is saying that Jesus did not resurrect physically after the crucifixion,
Does
but
sound like
that
that.
appeared in spirit matter where others could see him, which is interesting. And that also that he came as a human to say there's nothing wrong with the physical.
Mhm.
Yeah, the guide is saying he did not physically resurrect.
That's my understanding of how he's
Okay,
putting it there as well,
okay,
And I think I've heard that in other, I think Gnosticism talks about this too, only in a different way, but and I don't know. I mean, but yeah, it
yeah.
is different than sort of like this focus that, especially I think Catholicism and the other traditional Christianities have about this need for him to physically resurrect. And I guess at the end of the times, like all of the dead people are gonna come out of their graves in their physical bodies. I
Right,
don't
right,
know.
right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Thank you.
that makes
Yeah,
a little like it seems reasonable to me that it was more like a huge psychic manifestation of his presence, and so, if really our bodies are energetic ultimately anyway, that, and we do have a ultimate energy body that still survives death, and then if it can, be kind of filled in with enough light and matter particles or something, you could probably be seen, and many visions and manifestations like that seem like, more, we see these energetic things, that, there are very, very subtle, but they can, with enough power, break through into the more physical dimension. And so that would make some sense to, probably more to me in some ways than a physical resurrection. But I don't know that it's an important, maybe it is.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, everybody. Okay, Davis.
I just like the complexity of it all. So like you fear life, so you go towards death, but in that going towards death, you're fearing in this life the same death, the little deaths every day,
Yeah.
and the ultimate death at the end. So you go towards it. And it's like very complex and very multi-layered. On top of at the end where he on kind of on the same vein where you've kind of like fearing going towards religion out of fear of the
Right.
consequences of the afterlife, but you're kind of at the same time also fearing this life.
Exactly. Good. Yeah.